Dehradun, ICFI Law School, would like to welcome you all to the third day of 7 Days National Workshop on World Wildlife Week under Center for Environmental Law, Policy, Education and Development, also known as CELPID. I would like to take the privilege to extend a heartwarming welcome to our speaker of the day, Dr. Dhananjay Mohan, IFS, Director, Wildlife Institute of India, Dehradun, who shall be speaking on wildlife conservation in 21st century. Thank you, sir, for being with us today. Along with him, I would like to welcome Professor Dr. Muddu Vinay, Vice Chancellor, the ICFI University, Dehradun, Brigadier Rajiv Sethi, Registrar, the ICFI University, Dehradun, Professor Dr. Yugal Kishore, Dean, ICFI Law School, Dehradun, and Mrs. Monica Kharola, Academic Coordinator, ICFI Law School, Dehradun. Also, I would like to welcome all the participants who have joined us today and would request all the participants to kindly fill the feedback form during the session, which shall be circulated in the chat box on Zoom platform and comment section on the YouTube. Now, I would like to call upon Professor Dr. Yugal Kishore, Dean, ICFI Law School, Dehradun, to address the gathering. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Madam Anushmi Jan. So, my most esteemed, learned friend from the forest circle. I mean, sir is an officer, sir is doctorate in this field as well as IFS officer. So most learned friend of mine, Dr. Dhananjay Mohanji, and academicians from different part of the country as well as my own institution, law professionals, and the members of this particular center, CELPID, who have organized this particular event of 7 days during the Wildlife Week. And my dear student friends, this is a very golden opportunity which has been provided by senior officers like our Dr. Dhananjay Mohan Sahab, that they are trying to provide you knowledge about the wildlife during this workshop of 7 days, in which already 2 days have been passed, 2 days are third day. As you know very well, of course, some of you may not be there, so I repeat that the first day we had Mr. Sumant Bedi Madhosi ji, who has talked about that interaction on with wildlife, conflict or coexistence. Simultaneously, a very, very senior officer of the Forest Service, Mr. Jairaj Saab, was here, who has talked about human and wildlife conflicts. We call it as conflict, but sir was calling it as coexistence. So now we will also be calling it coexistence, because in law books, what we get is conflict. Anyway, so they were there on the first day. Then the second day, as you know, as you have already seen yesterday, our Dr. Rakesh Kumar Shah was here. He has also talked about wildlife conservation and agro industry. Today, we are very fortunate to have a very, very senior person who is having a very good field experience in this, and Dr. Dhananjay Mohan Sahab. He will be talking about wildlife conservation in the 21st century. But here, one thing I would like to add, that the type of approach we have towards environment is anthropocentric. Anthropocentric means human-centered. And thereby, we take all the species as well as the constituent of environment, that as they are the things which are there to serve us. And thereby, we do not take care of them properly. We take them as our subservient. We think that we are the masters. But that approach is not correct. In fact, there has got to be a equilibrium, which we call it an ecological equilibrium between all the constituent of the environment. Because as you know very well, air, water, land, and as well as other species, whether it is wildlife birds or plants, even microorganisms, they all interact with each other. And because of their interaction, we know very well that ecological balance is established. And that is what we need in the environment. But then, because of the number of pollutants and because of the number increase of some of the of human being, so human being requires power, human being requires place, human being suffers from poverty, human being is having a very thirst for development. So therefore, actually looking at the Mahatma Gandhi, who once said very rightly that we have enough to provide the needs of the nature, has enough to provide the needs of the people, but not the greeds of the people. But now people have become greedy. We are going in such a direction that we are not thinking about the wildlife as well as other species. So biocentric approach in which all the species should be given due importance, are ecocentric, wherein all the constituent of environment, including wildlife and other species, they should be given due importance, should be the whole thrust of it, and we should give them proper importance, and then only we will be capable of conserving the wildlife in this 21st century. But of course, sir, our most respected Dhananjay Sahab is here. He is having practical experience. He will tell us that what has been done earlier during the wildlife conservation and what we should do during this 21st century to conserve the wildlife so that they are not extinct. So with this, I request Anishmi Jain Madam to call upon our speaker, call upon our Monica Kotialji to give a brief introduction of our great speaker of the day, learned speaker of the day, and then start the program. Please, Madam Anishmi Jain.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your kind words, sir. Now I would like to call upon Ms. Monica Kotial, Assistant Professor, ICFI Law School, Dehradun, to introduce our speaker of the day, Professor Dr. Dhananjay Mohan, sir. Please, ma'am.
Thank you, Nashmi. Dr. Dhananjay Mohan. Dr. Dhananjay Mohan is a member of 1988 batch of Indian Forest Services, Uttarakhand cadre. Before taking over Director, Wildlife Institute of India, Dehradun in January 2020, he served as a Principal Chief Conservator of Forest, Planning and Financial Management and Chairman State Biodiversity. In the state of Uttarakhand, he earlier served in the Wildlife Headquarters of Uttarakhand Forest and Department for over 5 years. He is graduated in Electrical Engineering from IIT Kanpur. He has managed protected areas in undivided UP and written management plans for many of them. He did his postgraduate diploma in wildlife management in the year 1992. He was awarded as PhD degree on habitat selection of birds in New Forest, Dehradun, India, by Wildlife Institute of India, Center of Forest Research Institute, University, Dehradun. He served as the Associate Professor in the Indira Gandhi National Forest Academy, Dehradun, from 1998 to 2004. Dealing with the subject of wildlife conservation, he has undergone short courses on biodiversity conservation management at the University of Wales. He has undergone short courses on biodiversity conservation on management at the University of Wales, Bangor, UK, and Colorado State University, USA. Later, he served as professor in Wildlife Institute of India, Dehradun, from 2006 to 2013, where he was avifaunal research and collaborated with University of Chicago to conduct research on Himalayan bird diversity gradient. He has avifauna his primary interest. Some of these were publications of topmost international journals like Nature, Nature Communication, American naturalist, biology letters, and general of ornithology. Dr. Mohan has been passionate bird watcher and naturalist for nearly 4 decades and has spanned the length and breadth of the country in pursuits of it. Dr. Dhananjay is a fellow leadership for environment and development lead, a program initiated by Rockefellers Foundation. He has been recipient of Dr. Salim Ali Fellowship of Ministry and Environment and Forest, Government of India. In 2005, he served as a constant tutoree and supervised a doctoral research and 6 MSc dissertations in wildlife science and forestry. Dr. Dhananjay Mohan, sir, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kotial, for this such an elaborate introduction. I hope I'm audible.
Sir,
Yes, sir, you're audible.
sir.
So, and I would like to thank ICFA University, particularly the Vice Chancellor, Sir, Dr. Muddu Vinay, and of course, Dr. Yugal Kishore, for giving me this opportunity. I always look forward to interact with students in particular, and this is a very, very relevant group, students who are pursuing law. And as I was speaking a little while ago with Dr. Kishore, I mean, our sector is a growing sector. I think the concerns in environment, wildlife, forests are huge, and people in our country are really bothered by the way things are happening in this sector. But at the same time, we do not have a lot of legal support. So I would like more and more students to get interested in this sector, and through your knowledge of law, help in conservation, because that is where we really lack. So I would like to, on this occasion of Wildlife Week, request my dear students of ICFA University to take interest in this sector. It's a very, very challenging sector and a very interesting sector as well. And I'm sure you'll feel very satisfied when you see that through your work, you are actually helping in conservation. Because the animals don't have, the wild animals don't have voting rights. We have to think about them. There is no other go. So with this, I think I'll switch over to my presentation. It's a brief presentation. I can see that you have invited a number of good speakers throughout this week, and all of them actually are my IFS colleagues. So I suspect that there'll be some overlap in what I'm saying and what they have said or they'll be saying in the coming weeks. But please bear with me, because I don't know what exactly they have said or they're going to say in the coming days. So what I will do is I'll briefly talk about the little bit of a background of wildlife conservation in India, how things have been shaping up particularly over the last 50 years, and how it has brought us to the place where we are today. And then how do we go ahead from here? So this is crudely going to be the structure of my presentation today. So I think I will just start sharing the presentation. Yeah, I hope it is visible now, the presentation.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right. So these are figures which everybody talks about, biodiversity richness of India, and it's actually really a very, very rich country of the country of ours. It's one of the 12 mega biodiversity countries in the world, with such a small area, 2.4% of the land. That too is packed with human beings. We all know that. Even then, we have 7 to 8% of recorded species of the world. So that speaks volumes about the diversity that we have in our country. It has 3 of the 34 biodiversity hotspots of the world, and a little over 1/5 of our area is under forest. So this is also not a mean achievement, considering the kind of dependence that we have, the huge population that our country has. And I mean, I must speak more on a positive note. I mean, some of the greatest achievements have been made in the last few decades in this sector. And I think the biggest achievement, I am talking about tigers. Everybody loves to talk about tigers, but I'll just be talking about tigers very briefly here. But it's more like a symbol of conservation in India. And, you know, it's a national animal. And the kind of achievement we have done over a very short period of time is I mean, really something to feel proud about for every Indian. I mean, in a very short span of 12 years, we have doubled the number of tigers. I mean, I would say we have facilitated the doubling of the number of tigers. It's the tigers who have doubled themselves, but we have facilitated. So we have now nearly 3,000 tigers in this country. And when we started the scientific protocol of estimating tigers, well, let me just say that estimating wild animals is a very tricky job. I mean, we often, the way it is projected in media, one feels as if you can go in a forest and just count them 1, 2, 3, 4, like we can count human beings or students in a class. It's not like that. So it's a very tricky thing, and very difficult. With great difficulty, we can bring in reliability in these numbers. So with tigers also, this effort was done, and my institute, the scientists there, some very famous scientists, they actually contributed immensely in this matter and developed a scientific protocol. And from 2006 onwards, we've been following this protocol and actually estimating tigers with good scientific rigor. So, I mean, that is what has led to this these numbers. I mean, many of you would remember in 2006, maybe some of the students may not, because students actually in 2006, many of you would have been much younger, maybe school kids. So you may not have registered, but for people of my age and some senior people in this today's gathering, they would remember that magical number 1411, and some of the mobile companies also picked up that number, and there were hoardings, only 1411 left. So that was the scenario in 2011 and 2006. And 2018, our latest estimation, the number has skyrocketed to 2967, and 2 years have passed since then. So we are very confident it's well above 3,000 now. So we have more than doubled the tiger numbers in just 12 years, and India has 70% of world's tiger population. So this is not a mean thing. With more than a dozen countries which are in the tiger range, rest of them all contribute to barely 30% of the tiger population, and rest is everything is with us. So it's symbolic because tiger actually occupies some 18, 19 states of India, and barring some of the northernmost states like Jammu Kashmir, Himachal, Haryana, Punjab, it's there practically everywhere, all over the country. So it's symbolic of conservation. So if you are doing, if tigers are doing well, that means majority of the other species are also doing well, because it's the area which is protected. And tiger is the flagship of those areas as the apex predator. So definitely, I mean, despite all odds, despite humongous population pressure that is there in our country, we all know that. We all go through that because we all have to compete with a large number of people for everything, be it marks in the school or jobs or everything. So we can feel how many people are there in our country. And they also put in competition with the wildlife. So despite that, despite all odds, I think this is no mean achievement. And the story is same for, I just picked up a few prominent species, same with many other species. Elephant, which requires large areas, even there we have been registering increase in numbers over the last couple of decades. And same with leopard and birds also. We have exceedingly rich, 1,300 species out of an estimated 10,500 or nearly 11,000 species in the world. So we have about 12% of the world's avifauna in our country. And another great thing here is that you have birds everywhere. You go to some of the countries, particularly in Southeast Asia and all, you stop seeing birds in urban areas, and you stop seeing birds in rural areas. Only the domesticated ones you see, because people have actually exterminated all of them. But not the case here. If you sit quietly in your home, within no time you will hear a bird call. So they are all around us, and we respect as Indian trait other life forms. We revere other life forms, and that is why they're all over. It's not just restricted to the sanctuaries and national parks. Many of our species, particularly birds and other smaller, lesser fauna, they are found all over, and they are being protected everywhere by people, by law. So this is really amazing that a country of 130 crores can still hang on to so much of biodiversity. But of course, I don't say that there are no issues, and we'll talk about them a little later as we proceed. Also about reptilian diversity, particularly southern India, Western Ghat, they have very great place for, it's a great place for reptilian diversity, amphibian diversity, because these are animals which are cold-blooded. Their diversity diminishes as we come northwards in the country because of the harsh winters. But yes, we have species in north also, but they're not the kind of diversity we have in southern India, because this group of reptilians and amphibians does much better in warmer climates. And some people jokingly say, no, since in southern India there are 3 seasons: summer, summer, and summer. So that may not suit people, but it suits the reptilians and amphibians. Another iconic animal, rhinoceros. There also the population is steadily increasing. And I talked about the biodiversity hotspots. So these are small areas wherein a lot of biodiversity is packed in. So as I said, I'll just take you through how things have been evolving in India, because it's very important to know the recent history to decide where we want to go. That's the whole idea about studying history. So I'll just take you through a timeline of history and evolution of wildlife management in India. See, I mean, just around the time when we got independence, the first, of course, I would say that even in the British era, there was a section of British society which was concerned about conservation. Majority of them were only interested in hunting down animals, and even much of Indian monarchy and Indian, the rich people in India, they were also in a way emulating the Britishers in this matter. But there were voices. I mean, I would like to name Jim Corbett, a person who has been known as a legendary hunter turned conservationist. And I'm sure some of you, at least in the audience today, must have read his very interestingly written books, wherein he not only described how he went behind the man-eaters, but also described the nature very well. The birds, the other fauna, the plants. And it's actually, those books are amazing natural history collections. So he was one voice who started talking about conservation in the British era, way back in the 1920s and 30s, and actually helped in setting aside some of the areas as the earliest national parks and sanctuaries in this country. We all know about Corbett National Park. All the Uttarakhandis and people who are associated with Uttarakhand, all of you, we feel proud about the Corbett National Park, and it has been very aptly named after this legendary hunter turned conservationist. And you know, Corbett National Park, actually, or rather I should say Corbett Tiger Reserve, it's legally now Corbett Tiger Reserve with National Park enclosed within. That is the area with the highest number of tigers anywhere in the world and the highest density of tigers anywhere in the world. So these are, and it's much ahead of the number 2 protected area. So we all feel proud of this area and the way it has been managed over the years as an iconic national park, which is there on the global map. People all over the world know about Corbett National Park. So anyway, I was just telling you, in the pre-independence day, there were some voices, but by and large, they were not heard much After we gained independence, of course, the national priorities were a little different. We had very stark poverty. The governments had a great responsibility to feed people, actually. And you all must have heard about the Green Revolution that actually helped the governments, helped the country, helped the people actually achieve this very basic need, that of food for everybody. I mean, people who have uh, gone through those days would know how difficult for a large share of our population, how difficult it was to just get a couple of square meals for the whole day. So the priorities were very different. We were very poor in industry, and everything was in a nascent stage. But nonetheless, I must appreciate that even in those days, there was a concern about wildlife. And 1952, the Apex Advisory Board, called the Indian Board for Wildlife, was set up. And it was headed by none other than the Honorable Prime Minister. So that shows that even in these early years of our independent history, there was a concern for wildlife conservation. And in the same year, the celebration of Wildlife Week started. See, I must um say that these are visionary people who could foresee that you can do wildlife conservation without involving people. And that is how measures like Van Mahotsav was also started around the same time to involve people in tree planting. Similarly, Wildlife Week was initiated in 1952 so that we can bring people together in wildlife conservation, because without that, it's just not possible. So, well, things were still moving on slowly, but I think around 1969-70, not only in India, globally, things started changing. And suddenly, a lot of interesting things started happening on the global arena. I think the 1969, we had the IUCN meet in New Delhi, and 1972, Stockholm Conference. I think this is one of the biggest global milestones in conservation of environment, forest, and wildlife. This was the first time when people started raising serious concerns that the way industrialization is going on, it may do some long-term damage to the environment. There was a conflict. There were developed countries which for whom the environment was very, very, I mean, they were getting very concerned about the environmental pollution and degradation of forest, loss of forest, all these things. At the same time, there were developing countries who wanted to be like the developed countries, and they didn't want to curtail their development by putting in curbs for forest and wildlife and environmental conservation. So there was a conflict. But over there also, the Indian leadership, led by Madam Indira Gandhi, gave a very balanced view, and it was largely widely appreciated that even though India is a poor and developing country, those days we were really like that, we had concern for environment. And that, I think, some way or the other comes from our socio-cultural milieu, the traditions that we have in our country, that reverence for life, all forms of life. That is somewhere which got reflected in her speech in Stockholm Conference. So 1970s, suddenly things started happening after the Stockholm Conference. Even in the country, there was a churning of ideas, and I think one of the biggest instruments, perhaps the biggest instrument, legal instrument, which helped in conservation in India, came into being in 1972, the Wildlife Protection Act. And till date, this is the most important legal instrument for conservation of wildlife in India. It is the pillar of conservation in India. So a lot of other things started parallelly. Species-specific projects, Girland project was started, and then the most celebrated project, the Project Tiger, because based on a very crude estimate, those days we had very primitive ways of estimating tigers. Even then, it came out that we are probably less than 1,800 tigers left in this country. Although at the turn of the century, of course, it's a debatable number, but it was anywhere between 50,000 to a lakh tigers in the country. So turn of the 20th century, I would say, 19th century, sorry. So this was a big concern, and the Project Tiger was launched. And this was a pan-India project, and I think this has been rated as one of the most successful models. It had its own problems in in between. I think in the 90s, particularly, there were a lot of problems which started surfacing for tigers. And then again, I think we have overcome them, and now we are on the proper trajectory. So this definitely has been the most important conservation initiative in the country. Then we had the crocodile project, another project. Of course, crocodiles are not so attractive and so glamorous species, so people don't talk about it. But actually, this really paid dividends, and our crocodiles could make, crocodilians, I would say, could make a comeback. Species like your Gangetic gharial, uh, so that was on the brink of extinction in 1975, when sudden measures, being reptilians, their human intervention can actually make very quick gains, because they, like most of the reptilians, they lay eggs, a very large number of eggs, but nature is such that it doesn't let most of them survive, because actually it's nature's way of controlling. I mean, usually a gharial, for example, a gharial nest would have easily some 100 eggs, but all of them, if they survive, you will have gharials all over, I think, even in our courtyards, so in our backyards. So nature takes care of it, and majority of them in their initial stage are extremely vulnerable. They get predated upon, and that is how the numbers are controlled. But because it was in the brink of extinction, because of poaching for its skin and habitat loss and all kinds of reasons, so the collection of eggs and raising them in captivity, letting them grow to a stage that they cross that vulnerable stage, and then releasing them back in appropriate habitats, actually helped. And I think in less than 15-20 years, gharial and magar were back, and even estuarine crocodile, the 3 crocodilians that we have in our country, all of them were back, with populations now thriving in many locations in the country. It's a very successful project about which people don't talk so much, but it's definitely been a very successful project. And then there were other things were happening on a global platform. CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, India ratified this. And along with that, it also in the subsequent years became signatory to many other conventions. Then the government did realize that we need to take the subject of wildlife in the for research and education. We need more trained people, field managers. So they set up this Directorate of Wildlife Education, which was a precursor to Wildlife Institute of India, which I head now. We had another very important legislation coming in, Forest Conservation Act, which indirectly helped wildlife conservation as well, because this actually brought almost to a grinding halt the diversion of forests. Because prior to that, if government required land, the forest land became the normal choice, because if you take land from some other place, there'll be people owning it. There'll be major issues about relocating people. There'll be issues about paying them the price of their land. All those complications are always there. So the natural choice used to be the forest land, because there were no people there, and government owned it. So a lot of forest was getting diverted into a lot of developmental projects, and the central government realized that we need to put an end to this, or at least regulate it stringently, so that they don't become the default choice for developmental processes. And this act still continues to help conserve India's forests even today. Then the World Conservation Strategy, even in the global platform, 70s and 80s were very important decades where a lot of things were shaping up. As I said, 1982, the Directorate of Wildlife Preservation was upgraded to a separate institute, which became an autonomous institute 4 years later. And as the initial mandate, the WII, Wildlife Institute of India, came up with a National Wildlife Action Plan, 15-year comprehensive plan to take India's wildlife conservation ahead. We signed a few more conventions, which are very important. Sorry, these figures I not forgot to update. We have now 8 World Heritage sites and some, I think, 28 Ramsar sites, and more conventions, bilateral convention agreements, and more conventions came up. Biosphere Reserve Program, which is a special program, because till this time, the protected areas, the sanctuaries and national parks that we were creating used what is called an exclusionistic approach. It said, keep the people out to conserve wildlife. Okay, so this was a model which maybe was fine in the beginning, but it is not a very sustainable model, in the sense that until unless you involve people, you can't sustain conservation. So biosphere reserve is the whole idea was that man was central to conservation, and even certain practices followed by human beings also need to be conserved. The traditional knowledge and all these things, I'm sure Shasa might have talked about these things yesterday. So that happened. And then another very important policy document which came in 88 was the new forest policy. I remember I joined the service the same year, and it was a major talk in the forestry and conservation circles, because this was a major shift. Till this time, we were following the 1952 policy, and prior to that, we had 1894 policy also. So the earlier policy looked at forest as a source of revenue, as a source of resources through which government can earn revenue and people can get end products. This was a policy which actually for the first time said that no, forests are there for the ecological well-being of the country and for the utilization of local people. The policy imperative, and so everything followed in this style only. That, I mean, these are not to be areas, forest areas, wildlife areas, are not to be looked at as areas from where you can get resources, you can make money, you can get revenue, and maybe commercial revenue at the cost of local people. So this was another major shift in the policy. And this was again something that happened on the global platform, World Commission on Sustainable Development. And by that time, sustainability became an important idea, that whatever we do with nature, the sustainability angle ought to be there. Otherwise, we can't afford to leave a world bereft of natural resources for our next generation. So, I mean, sustainability became a very important buzzword. And in fact, it was only 1985 that biodiversity as a word came into being for the first time. Today, it is being used so often, it's hard to believe that the word had its origin only 35 years ago. So, and then came the Convention on Biodiversity. This is a convention which has got I would say again, a huge influence on everything. And the climate change and everything is linked to this. This is a very important convention which is influencing the globe. Yeah, I mean, just around that time, sorry, we had the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. See, out this your Convention on Biological Diversity, to which India is also a signatory, it required the country to follow certain mandates for the conservation of biodiversity. Now, from wildlife, it started expanding into biodiversity, and biodiversity also included not only wild biodiversity, but domesticated forms of biodiversity also. So it really broadened. And actually, when you talk about domesticated forms of biodiversity, be it crop varieties, be it domesticated animal varieties, so they have a very strong bearing on human survival itself. So around that time, we started preparing the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. And also, that was the time when we came up with the Biodiversity Act of 2002. And I'm sure, again, Rakesh Sasa might have talked about it yesterday. He had a long innings as chairman of Biodiversity Board. I succeeded him last year on his superannuation. And he must have talked about the Biodiversity Act as well. So then, of course, 2002, we had a wildlife conservation strategy. And 2002 was another very important year, because that is the year we amended our Wildlife Protection Act. There were a few amendments prior to this also. 91 and 86 were big amendments, but 2002 was perhaps a very sweeping amendment to this act, made it more stringent. And for the first time, the Indian Board for Wildlife, with which I started on this section of my presentation, that was made into a statutory body. till that time it was an advisory body headed by the Prime Minister, of course, but it was still not a statutory body, and it was brought under the purview of the Wildlife Protection Act, and it was renamed as National Board for Wildlife. So National Board for Wildlife came into being after this amendment, and the Honorable Prime Minister is still chairs this board. And a lot of important things happened in this wildlife conservation strategy in 2002. Some of you must have heard about the eco-sensitive zones and the controversies and the problems associated with it. That also found its birth in this 2002 wildlife conservation strategy. As you can see, it says lands falling within 10 kilometers of boundaries of protected areas to be notified as eco-fragile zones under the Environmental Protection Act, which is another important legislation. It came in 1986 and talks, of course, a lot about pollution and its control. But through it, you can create eco-fragile zones for conserving the environment and the biodiversity. Things looked in positive trajectory then, but at the same time, certain jolts did take place in our conservation history. And I think 2005 Sariska crisis was a wake-up call. We were all perhaps getting a bit complacent that things are going fine, tigers are doing well, but then Sariska suddenly happened. And this is what actually led to developing scientific monitoring protocols for estimation of tigers, because Sariska actually was a lot of misreporting. There were annual tiger deaths, and because of our primitive estimation techniques and their poorer implementation, the warning bells were raised only after we lost the last tiger from Sariska Tiger Reserve. And then a slew of measures took place. 2006, we started the All India Tiger Estimation, scientific protocol-based, camera trap-based estimation, which has been evolving and becoming more and more rigorous with every cycle of 4 years. And this also led to another very important amendment to the Wildlife Protection Act, that is 2006 amendment, and that is the which led to the creation of National Tiger Conservation Authority. Now, this is an authority which has now taken a lead in tiger conservation, and it in a way replaced the Project Tiger. Now it's a much more powerful body legally. It's a body under the Wildlife Protection Act, and it has led to a lot of concerted effort for tiger conservation, and that is what is visible in the tiger numbers. What we started in 1973 with 9 tiger reserves, it is grown up to 50 tiger reserves. And not just that, NTCA also is overseeing conservation of tigers beyond these tiger reserves, because tigers do occur in forest areas outside tiger reserves also, and in some places in reasonably good populations. So they are also very important areas. So I think 2006 onwards, the kind of seriousness, the kind of effort has gone into tiger and tiger habitats conservation, which has actually helped a whole lot of species. The results are very much visible. So, to aid that further, again in the same amendment, it called for a creation of a Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, because wildlife crime is something which is quite different from forest crime. Forest crime meaning illegal felling of timber and all. Normally, the illegal felling of trees, it's more of a local affair. But when it comes to wildlife crime, many a times the linkages go to other countries, and the markets may be in some other country. The product may be coming from it. The conduit may be a third country. So it's a very complicated kind of a network. As they say that it's the third largest illegal trade in the world, the wildlife, the trade in wildlife and wildlife parts. So to deal with this, because otherwise the entire forest and wildlife management is with the states. The Government of India provides the overarching policy guidance to the states, and also, of course, a lot of funding comes from Government of India. But because much of the enforcement happens at the state level, so there are issues at times when you are dealing with wildlife crimes and the matter goes beyond your state. And as I said, here it goes to other countries also. So the state enforcement agencies find it very difficult to actually take it forward. And so we needed a body at the central level which can coordinate between states and even coordinate with other countries. So Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, which is again a legal body under the Wildlife Protection Act as per the 2006 amendment, it was created in 2000. Since 2008, it has started functioning, and it is actually doing a wonderful job by actually getting a lot of intelligence inputs in wildlife crime, coordinating with states, coordinating with other enforcement agencies of other countries, and actually helping in busting these national and international rackets. We have, of course, the National Wildlife Action Plan. As I said, it was first came in 1983, and for 15 years. Then we had the second one for the next 15 years, 2002 to 2016, and now we have the latest one on 17 to 31, which is a very well researched document with a contribution from all the stakeholders, and this is what guides the wildlife conservation in India. And I think the most recent thing, positive thing that has happened in this sector is, I'm sure many of you would have listened to our Honorable Prime Minister from the ramparts of the Red Fort on this 15th of August, from where he announced actually the launch of two very important projects, Project Dolphin, Project Lion. And these two projects, because see, we have been doing very well in the terrestrial ecosystems. As a tiger success story, I've talked about it many times now. But our rivers, actually, they also contain a lot of biodiversity and very unique biodiversity. They are actually not being looked after very well. They have been dumping grounds for our pollutants, all kinds of illegal use of river waters. Everything is happening. The rivers and aquatic systems are actually in a bad shape. And just like tiger symbolizes the entire wildlife of terrestrial ecosystems, most of the terrestrial ecosystems, except for the deserts and the high Himalayas, dolphins actually symbolize the aquatic biodiversity in our river systems, particularly the northern river systems of Ganga and associated rivers, Brahmaputra, Beas, Chambal, all these rivers. So about half the country's riverine systems, dolphin is like the apex wildlife species, and conserving dolphin would mean conserving the river system. So again, it will be the flagship species. So our institute, along with the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, we're working together to formulate the project document. And this will entail a collaboration and cooperation from a large number of ministries and a lot of other stakeholders. And it will be a mega project which will actually ensure the sustainability of our rivers. Similarly, the Project Land, because they are only restricted to one state, one region of Gujarat state. So we have to work towards its long-term sustainable survival. And so it's really a great thing that this message is coming from none other than our Honorable Prime Minister. So, I mean, all of you know that when it comes to protected areas, I mean, when it comes to wildlife conservation, protected areas, as we generally say, for our sanctuaries, national parks, and there are two more categories about which people don't know so much, the conservation reserves and community reserves. So these areas are the major pillar of conservation of wildlife, because these are areas which are set aside exclusively for the wildlife, where they can thrive in their natural ecosystem. So we have a large protected area network. Of course, India, as I said, has a huge population. The land is a very premium resource. So there is a limit to which we can let our protected area network grow. But nonetheless, despite that, with the cooperation of the local people, we have been able to actually make a reasonably large protected area network in India, covering about 5% of our geographical area. So these are the details of our protected areas, the four categories, as I said. And This is how our protected areas have been growing. There was a good growth recorded till about 1990. And then, of course, there were certain changes in the, as I said, 1991, we had a amendment to the Wildlife Protection Act, which actually brought the sanctuaries almost at par with national park. So the state governments, because actually much of the functioning of governance in an area is controlled by the state government, the state governments also have to be concerned about the issues of the local people. And there's a lot of dependence of people in our country, poor people, tribal people, on the forest areas around. So the moment you declare an area as a sanctuary, there's a curtailment of rights, of course, through a process of settlement. But nonetheless, people do feel that an area they've been using traditionally has now been in a way taken away from there. So after 1991 amendment, the states found it difficult to create new sanctuaries. Of course, national parks are even more stringent, so they were even more difficult. But even to create new sanctuaries was difficult because there was a lot of resistance from local people who could foresee curtailment of their basic rights over those forest areas. And many of them had huge dependencies on the local forest. So the growth was kind of stalled. And realizing this, in the 2002 amendment, the government of India in this amendment brought in two new categories, conservation reserves and community reserves. And they did not have very stringent controls. So that, as was mentioned right in the beginning, the idea of coexistence. The coexistence could happen. People could also use that area for their basic bona fide use requirements. And so such model was created through conservation reserves primarily, and the community reserves where the community owned lands and the community comes forward to create a protected area on their own land. So these two categories actually showed the way forward. And so you can see after 2002, the protected area network again started increasing. And now about a few months back, we were having a number of 903 protected areas covering a little over 5% of our geographical area, which for a country like ours is actually huge. So nearly 1/4 of our forest area is actually protected areas, but the remaining 3/4 also has great wildlife values, and they also are often surrounding the areas surrounding the sanctuaries and national parks, and they act as buffers, very important areas for wildlife conservation. So it's not that wildlife thrives only in this 5% area, it actually goes beyond that. So let me just come quickly to some issues that we are likely to face in the 21st century. Some of them have already been discussed. I think on the first day you talked extensively about human-wildlife conflict, so I wouldn't dwell too much on it. But there are other issues which I would like to touch briefly, so I'll go one by one through them. Habitat management. See, our protected areas are not necessarily purely natural, pristine areas. I mean, all of them have some kind of a history. They've been created only in recent times. Our oldest protected area was declared in 1898. That was in Vedanthangal, small wetland, but larger, proper, bigger protected areas started coming up only in over the last 10, 15, 5-6 decades. So most of these areas had some kind of a management history prior to that. They were areas often meant for commercial exploitation of timber, of course, in a sustainable manner. See, I mean, that is where I would, in a way, like to appreciate the foresight of some of the Britishers also, because in the 1860s, when they started exploiting the forests after 1857, they after the country came under the British rule properly after 1857. After that, there was some bit of thought about exploiting. Those days, natural resources were one of the biggest resources, and timber was one very big resource. And even in those days, they realized that if they just go on plundering the India's forest wealth, because at that point of time, Britishers never thought that they were going to leave this country. So they realized that if they go on plundering the forests of India, then there won't be much left after some time. So they thought that they ought to bring in some kind of a sustainability in timber harvest. And since they were themselves not very good at it, if you look at Britain, it hardly has any natural forest. Whatever forest is all planted. So they were themselves pretty bad in it. So they actually engaged a German consultant, Dietrich Brandis, who came in 1861 to India and laid the foundations of scientific forestry. And he remained the Inspector General of Forest. Those days, this was the topmost position countrywide in the forestry sector. And he laid the foundations of scientific forestry. And the basic tenet of this scientific forestry was sustainable utilization of forest. So the concept of sustainability that way was rather old, more than 150 years old, but it was applied primarily to the timber, taking out timber from our forests. But nevertheless, what happened that many of our forests that we see today, some of them have now been included in protected areas, sanctuaries and national parks. They were actually being harvested for timber since the 1860s and 1870s. So because of the scientific forestry that was followed, they were not plundered. There were changes brought in there. In some places, some exotics were brought in. In some places, the species, natural mix of species was changed. But nonetheless, they remained forests. And in many places, they remained reasonably natural. At least the species were there were the natural species. So because of this management history, there are places even in our protected areas where you have exotics. And along with that came the noxious weeds, which accidentally got into our country. The most famous, most talked about is the lantana, which came as an ornamental plant to India. And then having no natural controlling agents, it came from Southern America, and it had no natural controlling measures. It really spread fast and is now occupying large swaths of our forests as an understory shrub, and really decreasing the productivity of our wildlife habitats. So it's very difficult to get rid of such things. Even if in your own kitchen garden, to get rid of unwanted grasses and all, that requires so much of effort. So here we are talking of miles and miles of forests. So very difficult, and because these are natural areas, we cannot go in for chemical control also. So the forest department all over the country keep trying to get rid of this problem, and they've been successful in some pockets here and there, but by and large they're there. So a lot of efforts are being done to deal with some of these major weeds and some of these exotics, but yes, with only partly successful. But at the same time, the efforts are on, and this is what ultimately improves the habitat quality. We have some great examples from Corbett Tiger Reserve, where some lantana infested areas were actually converted into natural grasslands through the intervention of the forest department, and now they are some of the prime areas of wildlife in the tiger reserve. So all these managements go on to maintain the vigor and productivity of the habitat, so that the wildlife therein can thrive well. And be it grassland management, water management, dealing with the exotics, they all lead to keeping the habitat healthy, so that the animals can be healthy and can occur in good numbers. Man-animal conflict, it's one of the biggest challenge for the forest managers, because this is what actually affects people directly. It affects lives, it affects property, it affects crops. So this is a direct hit on people. So naturally, it is something which really is an extremely high priority. We are trying to deal with this problem through a variety of ways. First day, they did talk about, as you said, as you told in the beginning, on coexistence. Easier said than done, but the efforts are on. In some places, there have been some amazing example where, see, it's not possible to actually deal with this problem in isolation again. If people feel that you can just get rid of these animals, or the problem animals. First thing, a lot of ground problems are there, identifying the problem animal, and so many other issues are there. A very important thing is to own up the problem. If people start owning up the problem, they realize that this is their problem. Then they join hands with the government, and a lot can be done. And as I was talking about certain successful example, Maharashtra has taken the lead here. They have really done well in involving people in solving human-wildlife conflict, and actually got some good results. We are also trying to follow the same model in Uttarakhand, and the initial signals are very positive. So the solutions have to be area specific. They can contain the problem, not eradicate it, because the animals are going to be there. Every species has an innate desire for survival. Every individual has an innate desire for survival and procreation. So their numbers are increasing. So they have to spread out. There is competition within themselves, which is much more fiercer than competition with man. So they have to move out of the forest areas, find suboptimal habitats in human-dominated landscape, and come in conflict with people. So these are some of the major problem animals, and they have even started getting into urban areas. Monkeys, particularly, see how nicely they have adapted to the urban environment and creating so much of problem for people. So and some of them actually are related to the lifestyles, human lifestyles. We are producing so much of garbage now, which we never used to produce 30 years ago. And so monkeys have a ready food all the time available. And if it is not available on a particular day, they will not shy from raiding your houses or attacking people, because it's a primate, it's an intelligent animal. It knows that man is actually a very timid animal. So they can use that and survive very well in the urban environments. So there are a lot of mitigatory strategy, but I'm not going to go into details of this because it is first day. You've already talked a lot about it. There are short-term strategies, long-term strategies. Some of them are being followed with mixed success. So all these things are there. Yeah, and then we come, of course, to other things like monitoring. That's very important. As I said, I talked about tiger monitoring, how science came in and made the monitoring much more reliable, much more rigorous. And now we're trying to expand it to other species also. This year, we're going to start the science-based estimation of the snow leopards. Now, this is an animal which actually occupies very, very tough habitats in extreme northernmost part of the Himalayas, where very few people actually go there. And these are the areas bordering China, Tibetan part of China, and that is where actually you have the snow leopards in our country. And we'll know very little about this animal, and that is why it's also called the grey ghost of the Himalayas. So a lot of things have, a lot of effort is now going on, because it's again an apex predator of the trans-Himalayan zone of the country, and conserving snow leopard would mean conserving this unique ecosystem. So then, of course, tourism interpretation. Of course, this is where I think through wildlife, local people can generate livelihoods. A lot of good examples are there in front of us, wherein people see a value in conservation. I'll again give example from my own state, Uttarakhand. And if you go to Ramnagar, which is a tehsil of Nainital district, it's a fairly largish town. You will see that practically every family living in Ramnagar, their livelihood is linked to conservation, to Corbett Tiger Reserve or other areas around. So I remember whenever there was any problem in Corbett, the people in Ramnagar became worried, because they could see a linkage between Corbett and their livelihoods. So this is one intangible benefit coming out of our wildlife conservation. So it's extremely important, and we need to take it forward with more and more involvement of people, and then we will get the local support in conservation. See, if you lock an area that this is an area meant only for wildlife and nobody can enter, people will feel alienated. People will feel that we've been traditionally using this area, and now because of these animals, which sometimes raid our crops, sometimes attack us, now we are not able to get the resources from these forests. So these are our enemies, and they will go any length to trouble the wild animals. So that is not the model which will work. We are a democratic country. We have to listen to people. And so one of the important usufruct coming out of non-biomass based usufruct coming out of these areas is tourism. And if it is responsible tourism, sustainable tourism, which we aptly called ecotourism, then it doesn't really harm the ecosystem also, but at the same time gives continued livelihood to local people and affects their lives positively, and you win them over in no time. So this is the model which needs to go ahead, and we need better and better interpretation. See, if you are inviting tourists to any area, you have to see to it that they go back satisfied. And that is how understanding the nature and telling them about it in an interesting manner, that really helps in a big way in their satisfaction. So that is where interpretation and knowledge is very important. And people are actually through government run program and otherwise NGO run program, we have been training local youths as nature guides. And now I can safely say that in Uttarakhand, there are many hundreds of nature guides who are able to get livelihood on a regular basis through nature interpretation. Involving people, of course, I've already talked about it, and through various tourism, as I said, is one of the mainstays. And of course, the other legal mechanisms also there. For each protected area, you should have a management committee with due recognition, involvement of local people. The members have to be local people as well. And that is how you can deal with the issues of rights also. Of course, now we have the Forest Rights Act also, which ensures that the rights won't be curtailed if they are traditional rights of the people in any forest area. I'm just coming towards the end of my talk. There are resources. Well, every activity of the government or the society needs money, and wildlife sector also needs money. At times we are short of money, but gradually I think there is an increase. There are many schemes of the government like Project Tiger, integrated development of wildlife habitat, Project Snow Leopard, Elephant Project. These are all mechanisms, financial schemes through which wildlife conservation is funded by Government of India. Similarly, the state governments, all the state governments have their own nice schemes through which they fund conservation. And day by day, I think more and more money is being, it's still a very small share of the budget, overall national budget. But nonetheless, the good thing is that it is looking upwards and moving up. So, and then finally, I think I must briefly talk about the issue of conservation and development. All of you, do know that I think last 15-20 years, the Indian economy has been on an upward trajectory, and what used to be a poor developing country is now a major economic power of the world. So with this, the economic development to remain on an upward trajectory, we need infrastructure, and we need good infrastructure. So then only we can compete with other countries and bring in more and more investment in our country. So, and of course, other policies and procedures also have to be simplified. The ease of business, as they say. So when we develop infrastructure, it sometimes, in fact, many a times comes in conflict with nature. We're building a new highway, it may cut through a forest area, disrupt the movement of wildlife, degrade habitat, split it into parts. Okay, so all these issues do come. And there also I see a transformation. 20 years back, if there was something of this kind, the developmental agencies were not ready to listen to the welfare of wildlife or environment. But now times are changing fast. Most of the development agencies are now very sensitive toward these things, and development is needed. But at the same time, if we can do the development in a way that there are mitigatory measures and they harm the environment and the wildlife and the forest in minimal way, then perhaps the two can happen without too much of mutual damage to each other. So that is the model being followed in the country. I mean, it's just evolving, and the good thing, because I deal with these kind of cases and matters, so I can understand and appreciate. There is a wind of change, and generally things are definitely that way, looking up. And so we hope that in times to come, and this is the model which has been followed in some of the developed countries, you do see a lot of mitigatory measures whenever a developmental project comes into an area, be it a road or railway line or whatever. So we are also getting into the same groove and trying to follow the same model. So I'll stop here. I think I've exceeded the time a bit. Sorry about that. But I think we need to interact briefly with the audience.
Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful and the informative session, sir. As you have given a wonderful explanation through the PPT, so I won't think participants would require a live interaction. But, sir, I have taken the questions of some of the participants and the professor to the chat box. Should I raise it to them, sir? Raise it to you?
Yeah, I can also see the chat box, but you can actually pick them up because there'll be too many, I guess.
Sir, then I'll pick up
So
one or two.
you can just pick them up and speak out, and then I'll try to answer.
Right, sir. Okay. Akhilesh, sir, please first unmute Professor Rahul Mishra. Professor, are you there, Rahul Mishra, sir?
Yes, sir, I am there. Can you
Yeah, so Mohan sir is there. You can interact with him. Your question, please.
Yes, sir. Namaskar,
Sir, be a little loud, sir.
Yeah, sure. Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible, sir.
Okay.
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Sir, actually, I have a very practical question. Thank you very much for this wonderful insight, first of all. Having given due regard to all the conventions and laws which are there in place as of now, I just have a question with regard to the coexistence, you can say, of animals with human beings, because how can we make this phenomena working in 21st century, because you have also rightly pointed out through your presentation that there is going to be a conflict which has been there, but it can be narrowed down. Now, sir, in practical sense, what we should do as a layman, or you can say as a government servant, what sort of approach is to be taken into our consideration in order to narrow down this difference in between man and, you can say, animal? Over to you, sir.
See, when we talk about coexistence, of course,
Yes.
I'm not talking about coexistence everywhere. We're largely talking about coexistence in forest areas where we have people and where we have wildlife. So in such areas, in fact, if you look at the Wildlife Protection Act, it talks about tiger reserves, the model of tiger reserves, where it says there should be a core, which should be actually an area where there is no interference of any kind and serves as a good breeding area for tigers, and a buffer where actually there can be a coexistence. See, I mean, Indian people have evolved with wildlife. It's not that in traditional times, people were living in forests, even in traditional times, and they were wild animals, and they knew how to survive with them. Yes, sometimes there are accidents, I don't deny that. But at the same time, with some carefulness and with some protocols, we can actually manage some of these problems to a bare minimum. And that is how some coexistence can definitely happen in some of the forest areas. But at the same time, it's not, as I said, it's easier said than done. And there has to be a lot of discipline there, and people have shown this kind of a discipline in many places, particularly in the buffer areas of the tiger reserves, and even in some other areas. I take you to the example of Maharashtra in Junnar Tehsil of Pune district. It's a area in Maharashtra which is on the leeward side of Western Ghats with some degraded forests and all. And at one point of time, the problem leopards from Borivali National Park, which is in the heart of Mumbai, were picked up and left here. And they created a new problem in Junnar. and people were not used to leopards, and there were suddenly leopards there roaming around and using their sugarcane field to for their litters, and so there was a new problem. But then they started working together, department and the people, and people started. There was a big awareness drive as to how to survive with these leopards, and people learned that, and people became party to it. See, the problem is when you feel that there is a problem and the government should come and solve it.
Yes.
Who's the government? It's the people who make the government. So people have to own up the problem and join hands with the government, and then perhaps we can find a solution. So there are now in Junar area, every village has voluntary village protection force. These are youths which are trained in dealing with any problem leopard which comes in their areas, at least in the beginning. See, if there is a panic, then so they are the ones who control the panics, who control the people, who become the first phase for dealing with the human-wildlife conflict there. And then, of course, they send a SOS signal to the trained response teams, well equipped. They may arrive in an hour or two and deal with that. But initial part, because the locals themselves are able to deal with it, and this is how you solve problems, and this is the coexistence agenda. It's, as I said, it's easier said than done, but it can be done, and we have some successful examples. And see, again, monkey problem, I always say, it's there, it's troubling people all over in the cities. I mean, Dehradun also, I'm sure people do face this problem in many localities. But if you look at it, they are always looking, they will upturn your garbage bins, look for some food there. Some days you are happily even feeding them in the name of God. So they lose the fear of human being, and they have a steady supply of food in the urban environs. So why should they go to the forest and climb from one tree to another, live in the threat of being preyed upon by a leopard? This is much safer, much easier food, much more nourishing food, if I can say so. And well, if required, they can even enter your houses, open your refrigerator and pick up things from there, because they lose the fear from human beings. They're primates like us, so they are very intelligent animals. So this is a problem which we ourselves can solve. If we deal with our garbage very properly, don't leave it open. There are still a number of colonies in Dehradun itself, where still you are looking for an open plot of land to throw your garbage. So let me tell you, these are problems that we can ourselves solve. No government can come and solve. You may have a sterilization drive, this, that, but these things will take effect 20 years from now. We can't wait for 20 years to solve this problem.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Can't hear you, Vishal.
The next question is from Vikram Aditya Dio. Vikram sir, can you unmute yourself and go ahead? Yes, sir. Over to you.
Yeah. I was talking about the implementation of the CITES convention that India adopted in 75, and in 1973 it was opened for signatures. So this is more inclined towards the illicit trade of the endangered species, and recently there are certain governmental steps also being taken with respect to that.
Right.
So what more could we have as a legal framework? Are we going to have laws around CITES convention, or what kind of steps are being
yes
contemplated?
In fact, our Wildlife Protection Act is right now under the process of yet another amendment, and that is where I think the synergy with CITES is going to be created. However, I would like you to pose this question to our speaker on day 6, Mr. Samir Sinha, Dr. Samir Sinha, who has actually done a PhD on this, on the CITES and its implementation. So I'm not really, because CITES is exclusively dealt by Ministry of Environment and Forests, by the Additional Director General, who is the Director of Wildlife Preservation. So I don't have a first-hand experience in this, but I would like you to reserve your question for Dr. Samir Sinha. I'm sure he'll give you a proper answer. But yes, I'm aware that Wildlife Protection Act, the amendment which is in the pipeline, does have some to bring it in sync with CITES.
Right, sir. Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. And the last question is from Pradeep Kumar Shukla.
Yeah.
Mr. Pradeep, are you there?
Yeah, sir, I am here only.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Actually, I was asking why we can't make the bureaucrats and executives which are available with us in the democracy to function more ridiculously towards the wildlife protection and support from the local public.
See, I think you're talking about the echelons of bureaucracy outside the forest department, isn't it?
Exactly, not that much, but I try to include both from inside the forest and outside of it, both parameters.
So you say, why can't we make them more?
More involved and make them to work more for betterment of the actual laws and their implementation. Like you spoke of buffer system, na sir? Actually, the locals which are available there, and they are maximum times they intrude into the sanctuaries and the national parks, and by the verge of that, they are provided that relief. Okay, they are from the locals by the authorities only, and many times they used to, like in the riverbeds, they extract legally and illegally the sand and the stone peltings which from the rocks they extract. They are being done in the by the authorities only.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just Pradeep. Are you a student?
Yeah, sir. I am from Samarpan Law College, Gandhinagar.
Okay. All right, all right. So, see, what you are saying is, why isn't the enforcement perfect?
Exactly.
In a nutshell.
Yeah.
So, see, and it doesn't apply to the forest environment sector. It applies everywhere. You pick up any enforcement agency, you will find these shortcomings. You'll find all this. So, I think it's not. You've raised a question which doesn't have very clear answers. It is the problem is with the society in general. You can't expect that the set of people who have this responsibility come from some other planet and behave differently from the rest of the society. After all, they're coming from our society only, and there are all kinds of people amongst us, and the same representation is there in the bureaucracy also. There will be good people there doing good work. There will be less good people. There will be bad people. So all those things are there, and then we do not work in a very, I would say, black and white manner. A lot of things are gray, and that is how much of the management is. So many a times, even if people are well intentioned, there are so many other limitations to them that they are unable to function the way they want to function. So I think later, when you get into such responsible positions, perhaps you would realize these limitations in a better manner. But one should strive as much as they can to do these things in a proper manner. But then you are not God. You cannot do everything yourself. There are a lot of things for which you have to depend on others. And that is where many a times the most well-intentioned people are also not able to deliver the way we expect them to deliver. So I think it's a very generic kind of questions. Doesn't have any ready-made answers also. But I think as you understand things, the nuances, how the world moves, and it's not a problem limited to our country, by the way. It's there all over the world in varying degrees. All right. We often have a tendency to look only at the wrong things with us and good things outside. All right. I know I can't satisfy you with these answers.
So we can never satisfy any student with our answers. We cannot satisfy any student in the university also. Okay.
No problem. See, it is also linked to age. I don't blame them. Maybe when we were their age, we were also thinking the same way.
Yes, sir.
And so,
Actually,
I mean, you should have these kinds of thought. The most important thing is you should continue with these kinds of thought as you grow up further.
correct, sir.
They should not get rounded off. That is very important. Yeah, all the best.
Their questions should not go unanswered. Okay, thank you so much, sir, for the session.
Yeah.
Now I would like to call upon Academy Coordinator Monica Kharula, ma'am, for the vote of thanks, as sir has given already us a very informative and a wonderful session. Ma'am, over to you, Monica, ma'am.
Thank you, Vishal. Thank you. It's my privilege to thank the speaker of the day, Professor Dr. Dhananjay Mohan. Sir, it's been wonderful. You have given the insight into what were the various aspects that right beginning from the Britishers and how even the Indian Forest Service has been able to protect and preserve the wildlife and what all efforts are being done, whether it is through legislations and the hard work that they put in, how they have achieved various landmarks in protecting the wildlife. So you have wonderfully explained the historical aspect and the present day scenario also. And as you rightly said that, yes, we in society are part of the whole system and we cannot just leave things to the government because we are part of the government. In order to have a holistic protection, we have to take up the responsibility. So the government is just an extension of the people. And as you rightly pointed out, our students must keep that thought and that desire that we do well and help in implementing things much better and in a more absolute manner. That dedication must continue, and you have put it very well by saying that students must have that zeal and must continue to have that thought process even while they face limitations from the outside world. So thank you once again for the very informative session, and we look forward to your cooperation in helping CELPAD, the environmental cell that we have, in doing better and helping the students to learn more about environment and the responsibility of students and the community. So on behalf of ICFI University, Dehradun, I thank you, sir, for being with us and giving us a wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure completely. And I must thank all the organizers for inviting me here. I wish someday I could come in person and interact with the students. I really love that. And I'm sure it's a matter of months, and then perhaps we'll get that opportunity as well. Corona is not going to be there forever. So we will definitely, I would love to come and interact with the students directly. Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Dean, sir. Dean, sir?
I think he lost his connectivity probably.
No, he's there.
But
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Anushma, ma'am. Thank you, Monica Kotial, ma'am.
And Monica, thank you, Akhilesh.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Welcome, ma'am.
Akhilesh, sir, thank you so much once again.
Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much.
May I close, sir?
Yes, we may close now. Okay.